Okay, so we have a little bit different setup today, but we still be able to switch from webcam to slides and back. So we left off last class talking about employer and employee discrimination. Today we're going to talk about consumer discrimination, which is, I think we might have kind of finished with, but we'll do a quick recovery of it, maybe, if I don't have technical difficulties. All right, there we go. So basically, consumers have a taste for discrimination. It's going to put an additional cost if they watch games with whatever group they're discriminating against. So essentially, if we think about the demand curve as marginal benefit, if we add in some additional cost, the benefit isn't as high, we're going to have a decrease in the demand curve. So a decrease in the demand curve, we would think about now each team is facing a lower marginal revenue curve as well. If we think about the demand curve for labor, right, that has, let's see, well, actually just go right here so I can draw this. If we think about the demand curve for labor, we know that that's just the marginal wins that come from labor times the marginal revenue per win. So really, all consumer discrimination is doing is driving this down for whatever group they're discriminating against. So last class, I think we said kind of foreign players were a group being discriminated against. And so that would drive the demand curve down. All right. So we've got quantity of labor down here, wages. Supply doesn't change. Here's the original demand curve for labor. Kind of think about this as the demand curve for labor with discrimination. Call this W star, and this is kind of wage with discrimination, right? So consumer discrimination works a lot like employer discrimination in the sense that it shifts the demand curve. It's just shifting the demand curve for different reasons. For consumer discrimination, it's changing this marginal revenue per win by changing things in the actual product markets, right? Consumers being discriminatory means that we see shifts downward for ticket markets, right? If there's players of whatever group they're discriminated against, which then impacts the demand curve for labor. When we had employer discrimination, this actually stayed the same, and we had some additional costs. So it operates a little bit differently, but it's still going to have the same effect in that labor market, which is that it shifts the demand curve for labor downward, pushing the wages of that discriminated group downward. And we can take it a step further. All right, here's Q star, here's Q with discrimination, pushes that quantity we see of that discriminated group down lower, so there's fewer workers from whatever group is being discriminated against, or fewer players in this case. So we see labor market impacts, but what they're really coming from is that demand curve and marginal revenue curve in the product market. So whether or not that's tickets, apparel, or whatever product market we might see this decrease in from discrimination. Revenue and ticket prices will be impacted as well. This is going to work just like any other thing that we've talked about that decreases the demand curve for ticket prices. So whether they're at capacity or not at capacity, that demand shift may have different effects, but we've already talked about these, so I'm not gonna spend too much time there. It really would be a review, but we can kind of connect what we've already talked about with this new subject. So does consumer discrimination actually occur? So we wouldn't want to look at wages per se, because wages could capture consumer, employer, employee discrimination, quality differences, but you know, it is a good indicator if we can hold constant every other factor. We can't say that it's just consumer discrimination, but we can say that it's all types of discrimination. So Kane and Scher, I believe, they found black players earn 20% less than white players, all else equal. So if you could hold quality equal, and this is a slightly older paper, so it'd be interesting to see it redone today. But still a pretty sizable effect on black players that they make 20% less. Right? We also, if we look at attendance, right, that's probably a pretty good measure of just consumer discrimination. We see that a black player replaced by an otherwise identical quality, years in the league, you name the controls, the Kane and Scher were able to control for it. They find that attendance is about, if we took the average there, about 10,000 fans lower every year. So that's a pretty good indicator that maybe some of these wage differences are really being driven by this consumer discrimination as well. So mentioned this a little bit last class. It was kind of in the context of discriminating against certain people of different height. The example I gave was quarterbacks over 6 feet, and how statistical discrimination kind of made sense. So this isn't probably a term you see across a lot of other disciplines, although if we look outside of sports and you think about managers versus CEOs, we might see some discussion there, but positional discrimination is something we could also see. So baseball is the greatest way to look at it because it has a pretty good number of positions, and there's also significant variation in ethnic groups across those different positions. So you can kind of see the numbers here. We look at pitchers, 72 are white, as opposed to if we go down to outfielders, 46 out of the nearly 100. So it's not near as high of a percent. And you can kind of see the other positions as well. So catcher, pitcher is pretty high white concentration. First, second base, those numbers are a little bit lower, and you see higher numbers for kind of Latino, African American players, right? So we could have positional discrimination, which would work very similar to statistical discrimination in the sense that if they don't believe that a certain race can play a certain position, well, then they're just not going to give them a chance, and so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we can see that happen with just even positions and race as well. All right, so I think using height before, I wanted to kind of give a breakdown using race as well. And the problem is if you have positional discrimination, right? So even if it's not that, maybe you don't even buy into that different ethnic groups are different or better at different positions, even if you just have, even if it's completely random, luck of the draw, that there's a much higher percent of shortstops who are, they call it Latino here, than say catchers or pitchers. Well, that's a problem if shortstops on average don't make as high salaries as pitchers and first basemen, right? So because you have different racial demographic breakdowns in each position, and because we can see there's significant variation in the wages of each position, it could look like there is discrimination going on when in fact it's just for whatever reason the sorting of different racial groups or ethnic groups into these different positions. If those positions aren't as valued, it may look like discrimination when in fact it's not. It's operating through that marginal wins per labor that we talked about. Right? So the demand curve is just lower for those positions. If you have a higher percent of a certain racial group in that position, it'll look like they're being discriminated against when they're not. So it's really hard to parcel out a lot of these things. But this is another thing we would want to kind of factor in. But it could simply be statistical, right? So the problem is if in fact these teams kind of look at the shortstop position and say, well, only Latinos can play this position, so we're only going to be hiring them. Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And because the shortstop had lower wages in some of these other positions like first base, starting pitcher, well, then it is going to lead to wage differentials that was a result of originally statistical discrimination, okay? Usually it kind of asks to see if anyone else can think about one that could occur outside of Major League Baseball. I usually like to go to football and say what's one really, like that, there's actually probably two really good examples of statistical discrimination that occur in football, or positional discrimination, which would be, I don't think I have them written down here, so you might want to kind of jot these in as you're listening to this, but usually up until maybe more recently, the black quarterback was a great example of this, because for a very long time, no one had sustained success at the quarterback position as a black athlete, and so a lot of teams were passing on black quarterbacks, not giving them as many chances, when there's really no difference in the quality or because that player's black. Conversely, you have positional discrimination likely occurring, I think many would argue, at the running back position, where you don't see as many white running backs get as many opportunities. And it's not that even if the averages across those two groups are different, for any one player, they shouldn't be judged based off of the average of their group. And so those are two common examples that we would discuss in the NFL, as opposed to the kind of the examples I went through with Major League Baseball. And I'm sure there's ones you could talk. I'm sure there's something in basketball. Maybe you could argue the point guard position or something like that. And then it might not even be a black-white thing. It might be a European versus domestic player thing, which we talked about a little bit last class. Those could be our two groups that are kind of defining our discrimination tastes and preferences. Okay, so the next kind of topic we'll talk about is gender discrimination. So men and women often are not participants at the same venues or even within the same league. So it's very uncommon, right? We have a lot of leagues that are male or female specific. So a lot of times, we can think about this as the NBA and WNBA. They're completely separate leagues. Occasionally, you have things where you have crossover from males and females into each other's in a more predominantly male-dominated or predominantly female-dominated league, but very seldom. Right? So, I guess if we want to think about examples, the PGA, we've seen a little bit of this, auto racing. We could look for gender discrimination there a little bit easier than when we compare across leagues. And the reason why, if we look at maybe why is there a lack of women in these professional leagues, well, are there quality differences? Because we've talked about how discrimination last time discrimination was or segregation was ended because of economic incentives. So Jackie Robinson, high quality player, eventually doesn't matter what the taste for discrimination was, Major League Baseball, some team picked him up, right? Same thing should be true if we had a female who had a high enough marginal wins per labor, right? High enough marginal product. At a certain point, it doesn't matter what the taste for discrimination is, there's going to be one team that won't care. And so it's likely not a result of discrimination, but potentially differences that we see in this marginal product of the product of the players. And you can look at the physical differences, right? You're never going to have a female center who's 7'2", right? That's be very, very unlikely. Just the percent chances are much lower. So if we're comparing across leagues like NBA, WNBA, why would we maybe expect lower wages in the WNBA? So we'll go, before I show you that, well, maybe I'll justify it before I show you the graph so I don't doesn't make it sound like I'm the one who's gender discriminating. So if we look at these average attendance, and we talked a little bit last class, attendance isn't everything, right? Ticket prices matter as well. But if we just look at the attendance numbers between the NBA, right, and WNBA, I mean, it's more than a twofold increase. And if we look at ticket prices, we're talking about way more than a twofold increase. And so we've got pretty strong indicators that there's lower demand for the WNBA for whatever reason. So I'm not here to break down the social reasons behind why there might be differences in demand there, or talk about them, other than the fact that we have evidence that they exist, right? So it's likely that we could live in this world where, let's say we have the exact same supply of male and female athletes, right? They have the exact same number of high-quality female and high-quality male athletes in the NBA and WNBA. So both of them kind of face the same supply curve. Well, then we've got the demand curve for labor from the NBA. We just talked about attendance, and you can look them up right now if you wanted to and fact check. But ticket prices are much lower as well. So we have quantity and price evidence that the demand curve is going to be lower in the WNBA as well. So why is that demand curve going to be lower in the WNBA? Well, remember that demand curve is composed of these two components. So even if we had identical quality male and female athletes, because we have evidence that demand in the product market, right, demand for tickets, attendance and price of tickets is lower, it would drive that marginal revenue per win down, driving down the demand curve for labor in the WNBA, resulting in, hopefully I didn't sound too weird, much lower wages in the WNBA, right, as a result of these product market demand differences. Okay? And like I said, you could argue maybe these are a result of consumer discrimination against female basketball players. I'm not here to dispute that, but what we can say is we know that that's how it's operating. We know it's operating through a shift downward in the demand curve for things like ticket and apparel. Right? Okay. So, you can compare these average attendance. They're kind of interesting. I mean, minor league baseball and WNBA is very similar, and so we might expect that there could be very similar wages actually across those two leagues. Notice the NFL by far and away has the highest average attendance. Now these are game by game. So you'd have to multiply that by 16 games, and then Major League Baseball multiply that average number by 162 games, or divided by 2 if you're talking about just home games for a team. But pretty significantly higher demand in those two leagues than, say, the WNBA. All right. So, we kind of already talked about this, right? Based on everything that we can look at, TV viewer ratings, ticket sales, merchandise sales, the demand for women's sports is significantly lower. Now, you could look at one sport which is getting interesting. I think they're actually in court right now. Is the World Cup men's and women's, right? So you see very similar viewer ratings between the two. Just like we talked about, though, if attendance numbers were the same, ticket prices still matter. So even though we have the same number of TV viewers, it does matter how much these networks are willing to pay for those time slots, in terms of whether or not we would expect similar wages. But there is an argument there that, and really that shift down in the demand curve, if it's not coming from the marginal revenue per win, if there is evidence that ticket sales, merchandise sales, TV view ratings are the same, then it has to be operating through either lower marginal wins per labor, which, look, if they're playing the same game, similar positions are going to have similar effects, and then it must be coming from some additional taste for discrimination. Works the same way, shifting that demand curve downward. So we've kind of already talked about this. So are there any exceptions? Well, we actually see women's tennis TV ratings are comparable to men's, and we see that the wages are a lot more comparable between the top male and female tennis players. Women figure skaters and women gymnasts actually have higher wages if we look at the Olympic kind of what's paid to those athletes. And then UFC fighters, look, if you have any one fighter that has a high enough quality, right? It's like Ronda Rousey was at one time one of the top paid fighters in the UFC. Why? Because her marginal wins per her quality of play was so high. And it's kind of weird to talk about UFC, the marginal wins added, because you're your own team. But really this is a quality measurement, right? How good is a player? And also there was just a high following for her, so a really high demand for when and here, even not just winning, but just fighting, right? There was a high demand to see that. And so both these components were getting driven way, way up. If that demand curve keeps getting driven up, eventually you get just insanely high wages. So, we do have in individual sports, we can analyze this a little bit better, because if there are female fighters with high followings and they're not getting paid as high wages, well, then we might expect that even though the demand curve for their labor is high, there's some discrimination from employees, employers, you name it. And hopefully that autofocuses when I come back to it. Well, we'll see. Another evidence that we have that maybe gender discrimination is going on is when we look at coaches. So male coaches on average make way more in the NCAA than female coaches. But if we look at this once again, any number of metric we have, looks like there's higher demand for the actual team that player is coaching, right? But what about do men, right? So we would expect there's more male men basketball coaches than there are male women's basketball coaches, and there's almost no men's basketball coaches. So how could we look for gender discrimination going on in NCAA basketball? So if we just think about this in general, I would typically ask, why do you think it makes sense that, or think it makes more sense? Sorry, why do you think? Who do you think makes more as a women's NCAA basketball coach, men or female coaches, right? So there is evidence that actually women earn more, and there may be because there's just some type of complementarities. A lot more women's basketball coaches were also one time women's basketball players, and so they have more experience in this sport they're coaching. But there is evidence that reverse discrimination is within women's NCAA basketball coaching, women tend to get paid more than men. But like I said, we could make arguments that a lot of them had experience kind of prior. And there's some evidence of, and I read this paper, and it's not real, the metrics aren't strong, but there's some evidence that potentially this is occurring in golf as well for coaches. Okay, so what I wanted to get to, and this is kind of the paper I would usually have you guys read, and I'll get a couple questions posted up here, either late tonight or early tomorrow, regarding, this will be some of the iClicker questions we usually see, but it's racial discrimination in the NFL, specifically in terms of coaching, right? So the paper kind of details a lot of this. It's a lengthier paper, I think. Like I said, I usually just want you to read that intro, conclusion, look at the table. So I'll walk through it. It'll make it a little bit easier. If you listen to me talk about it now, you almost don't even have to read it. You should be able to answer the questions as long as you're paying attention to these table lectures. So from 1992 to 2002, only 7 of 92 head football coaching positions were filled by minorities. Right? So from that point on, the next 10 years, they filled 17 of 87 vacant ones. So what happened, right? What did we see this pretty sizable increase in the percent of football coaches who were African American? Well, 2003, the Rooney Rule began, which was that you had to interview at least one minority coach. Right? So now, after the Rooney Rule, this composition looks pretty good. 27% black head coaches, 72% white. This is head football coaches. This is a higher percentage than the U.S. population. Right? So it looks like that Rooney Rule worked, but we've got some other problems we could talk about and identify some other types of discrimination that may still be going on in the NFL. So one type of discrimination we could see is allocative, right? So if initial hiring is greater for minorities that are in lower wage positions, then it's less likely they're ever going to get to a higher wage position. So I'll give you this scenario. If we typically see that minority football coaches are only hired in as wide receivers coaches, cornerback coaches, while white coaches for starting position could potentially be something like offensive or defensive coordinator, well, it's much more likely then to get promoted to head coach as offensive defensive coordinator as it would be as a cornerback or wide receivers coach. And so kind of the initial hiring process, if there's discrimination going on there, it's going to look like there's discrimination going on at higher positions and less likely to earn these higher wages at higher positions. So within job discrimination would be that if we looked within the same position, performance was rewarded more for white coaches relative to minorities. This is the type of discrimination people typically think of, right? We're doing the same job, but I'm getting paid less than you. Right? So we think about this breakdown, right? I typically could see a lot of times linebacker, defensive line, special teams, defensive back coaches usually get promoted to defensive coordinator. The other kind of specialties on the other side get promoted to offensive coordinator. And then either one of those coordinators is then promoted to head coach. Right? And so if I tend to see more white coaches hired initially at these positions, they have one less step they have to go through. Right? So we look at the percent breakdown in the first coaching job. Notice, which is crazy to me, I'm guessing these were college coaches, right? But there were a few white head coaches that were hired without any prior, they didn't have any that was their first job in the NFL. We have a few white coaches who were first hired in the NFL as offensive or defensive coordinators. I'm guessing these are either ex-players or college coaches making the jump. But notice there are absolutely no black players who were first hired into those positions. So we've got a pretty good evidence that there might be some within job, right? Even given the same quality, we see no black coaches hired in those positions. Then here's probably some more, I think the most interesting one. If we look at quarterback coaches, who they kind of break this down in the paper, have a higher likelihood of getting promoted to offensive coordinator, who have a higher likelihood of getting promoted to head coach. Look at the breakdown there. You have almost all the quarterback coaches white and only a few black. So if you get your first job as a quarterback coach, the path is much easier for you to get to become a head coach. Right? If we look at the breakdowns across the other ones, it looks like I think the only one, right, tight end, offensive line, those tend to be higher percent white. And then I think and linebackers, special teams, but every other one, it's pretty disproportionately, positions, players. So we got what? Defensive line, running back, wide receiver, and defensive backs, all much more likely that's where a black coach gets their first position, meaning they have to go through a whole other hurdle, and none of them are getting initially hired at the coordinator or head coach position. So got some evidence of allocative and within job discrimination there. They then kind of break this down and are able to estimate conditional probabilities. So if I've got the percent of black players and the percent of white players, kind of different colors here, percent of white players who get hired into a defensive or offensive coordinator much higher than black. Defensive back, much higher percent that a black coach gets promoted to that position as opposed to a white. And then kind of these ones are pretty low percentages here, right? The main ones that are being driven is this. It's much more likely for white players being promoted from the coordinator position to head coach. So not only do we have an allocative issue in the fact that they just start out that there's more white players who are at a defensive offensive coordinator, it now is that they are even more likely to be promoted to head coach, even within that same position as the other black defensive and offensive coordinators. So we've got discrimination going at multiple levels. If we also look at the percent of coaches who played their NFL, their first jobs, NFL position in college, it is kind of, some of this may not be driven by discrimination, but just that it's much more likely that we have kind of black players playing whatever position they initially start out coaching, right? And so some of that's being driven by just the experience of the candidates who are applying for positions. So this is all good and well, but we all know that, and really for your projects, you should start be thinking about, we need to get some type of data we can run a linear regression with, right? And this one's probably even a little bit more of a complicated linear regression than I would expect you to do, because we haven't really talked about logit models too much. But a logit model is just where the outcome, or your y variable, right, is a 1, 0. So if it's a 1, 0, now the interpretation, let's see, I'll go here. Let's see if we get this to autofocus for me. Well, you'll have to excuse this, but I think you guys can probably, hopefully, read it a little bit. All right, so our y variable here, our typical linear regression, there it goes, is, did they get promoted? Well, promoted is either a 1 or a 0, right? So now, what they're going to be interested in is, were they black, right? This is a 1 or a 0 as well. So now the interpretation of our coefficient is, if a head coach was black instead of white, the probability that they get promoted, right, the increase from 0 to 1, the increase in the probability would be whatever that coefficient is. Okay? So, let's go back here. So now the interpretation of our coefficients are the increase in the probability of being promoted. So we look at this variable here, and they control for quite a few things here. We've got what? Years of experience in the NFL, whether or not they were an offensive coordinator, what the year was, the age of the coach, their performance, and I forget all the details of how they measure this. It was some combination of the wins and losses of their teams, but also the rank of, whether or not they were an offensive defense coordinator, the rank of their side of the ball. And so they can try to control for as much as they can. And in this first one, they look at it and say, okay, look, is being white, does that have a positive effect on being promoted from a coordinator position to a head coach position? And it looks like maybe there's a positive effect, but it's not significant, right? So if we looked here and turned this into a test statistic and found the p-value, it'd be pretty large p-value. And we only reject the null, and the null that starts out is that the effect of this variable is 0. We start out there. So unless we can find that it's statistically significant and we can reject that null, then there is no statistically significant effect. So this paper was kind and added those stars that we've talked about. So this one estimate would be significant at the 95% level. 1 star, the estimate is significant at the 90% level. And they don't have any 3 stars, but that would be significant at the 99% level. So we'll see here, there's no real impact of race in getting promoted from a coordinator position to a head coach. And they identified different time periods, even from the even since the Rooney Rule, right? Even since the Rooney Rule, that hasn't changed at all. But the interesting thing is, even including years where we have the Rooney Rule, being a white coach makes it more likely you get promoted to those coordinator positions from any position, right? Or sorry, that you get promoted from not just those coordinator positions, but even from quarterback coaches or defensive back coaches to any position. So you're just much more likely just to get promoted, right? And then you're also way more likely to get promoted to head coach, not from the coordinator position, but from the other positions. Once we include all those other positions like quarterback coaches, you're much more likely to get promoted to head coach if you're white when we include all the other coaches as well. So we've got some evidence that discrimination is going on there. They do kind of a similar thing, promotion to head coach in these first four. They include some, increasing level of control variables here. So really these first three we don't want to look at. Once you include for what their current position was, what their first position was, looks like there's no impact of race on being promoted to head coach, right, from any position. But so maybe within job promotion there's no discrimination going on, but there's a huge effect of being white on whether or not you're promoted to coordinator. And if we go back, we know coordinators are the ones that had the highest likelihood of being promoted to head coach. And so we have that kind of allocative discrimination occurring there where, yes, you're no more or less likely to be promoted to head coach if you're white, but you're way more likely to be promoted to a coordinator position, right? And once you're in that coordinator position, then it's more likely you get promoted to be a head coach, right? So this paper was pretty, at the time, alarming. They really, I think, initially started out just wanting to see if the Rooney Rule had an effect. They found it really didn't when it came to promotion to head coach from coordinator positions or to a head coach. But they did find that the Rooney Rule had really no impact, and there's still this huge racial discrimination going on from promotion to any other position to coordinator, right? Okay, so that's what we have for this week. I would suggest kind of reading through the intro and conclusion for that paper. I have left up the original video of graphs that I was drawing, so a lot of it would have been what I did today. Just maybe I said it slightly differently then. So I'm going to leave it up there on YouTube. You don't have to watch it, but if you do just want to hear it in a different way, I'm sure I said it slightly different. You can watch that as well. Other than that, I will get those few questions posted that will kind of count as our iClicker points this week. And we now have for sure covered everything you'll need to complete that third homework that was up there on Canvas, even prior to us prior to us going fully online. So, all right, I will try to get the next recordings up early next week, hopefully on Monday. Should be able to have those up there and start getting all the materials posted on Sunday night, and then the videos up Monday morning from here on out. If you have any other suggestions or want me to try a little bit something different, or if I can add something in, I'm open to those suggestions. But thanks for bearing with me, and I will be talking to you next week.